A kid grows up in a box of logs with no windows. Not cozy, not rustic. One room chinked with mud, a dirt floor, an animal hide nailed over the doorway where a door should be. His mother dies when he's 9. Every day he ever spent inside a schoolhouse, added up, comes to less than a year. He teaches himself to read by firelight, because candles cost money the family doesn't have. And that ragged, half-wild rail splitter ends up running the country. Not just running it. He drags a nation back from the edge of splitting in two. He kills slavery. He stands on a battlefield and says 272 words that American kids are still forced to memorize a century and a half later. Now here's the part that should stop everything cold. 5 days after the biggest victory of his life, a man walks up behind him and puts a bullet in the back of his skull. In a theater. On the one night, he finally let himself breathe. This is a story of a broke nobody from the middle of nowhere who rewrote the whole American experiment. And it's no clean little fairy tale. It's depression, backroom knife fights, a war that ate 600,000 human beings, and one gunshot that still echoes. It starts where he started, with nothing. February 1809, Kentucky. A boy is born in a one-room log cabin and named Abraham, after a grandfather who was shot dead by native raiders on that same frontier a generation before. So the name already carries blood. His father, Thomas, was a carpenter and a farmer who never once caught a break. Couldn't read, signed his name with an X, kept hauling the family from one patch of dirt to the next, chasing a better life that never showed. The mother, Nancy, came from nothing herself, gentle, deeply religious. Couldn't read a word. What she gave little Abe were Bible stories told from memory. That was the whole of his early education. A mother's voice in a dark room. The cabin ran maybe 200 square feet. No glass in the walls. Glass was for rich people. A hole in the roof to let the smoke out. They slept on corn husks and animal skins. This wasn't charming pioneer life. It was cold and hunger and grime. By 5, Abe was hauling water and swinging an axe. The only job on the list was stay alive. But the kid was starving for something the farm couldn't feed him. He tore through any book he could get his hands on, and out there, hands didn't land on much. The Bible, Aesop, Robinson Crusoe, A Life of Washington. That Washington book he borrowed off a neighbor and tucked under his pillow. And overnight, the rain came through the busted roof and warped every page. The neighbor wanted paying, so Abe worked 3 straight days in the man's field to cover one soggy book. And then he damn near memorized it. That hunger is the whole story. Hold on to it, because it's about to run headfirst into the worst year of his young life. Abe is 9. The family's moved to Indiana, a new cabin, somehow worse than the last. Autumn, 1818. A sickness rolls through the region. They called it milk sickness from cows that grazed on a poison plant. It killed people by the dozen. And it came for Abe's mother. Nancy went down with fever and convulsions. No doctor within 50 miles, no medicine anywhere. She died slow, over the better part of a week, while her 9-year-old son held her hand and could do absolutely nothing. Thomas built the coffin out of boards. Abe carved the wooden pegs to hold it together because there were no nails. They buried her on a hill by the cabin. No preacher, there wasn't one to be found, so no words were said over the grave. Months later, a traveling minister passed through, and the boy begged him to stop and say a prayer at the spot. Only then did it feel like his mother had been put in the ground like a person. The year that followed was a pit. Thomas sank into a black mood and drank. The kids went half feral, eating whatever they could catch. And then Thomas rode back to Kentucky and came home a few weeks later with a new wife. Sounds cold. Sounds like the sad ending. It was actually the start of something. Her name was Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with 3 kids of her own. Let's be honest about it. This was closer to a business deal than a romance. He needed a woman to run a house. She needed a man to feed her children. Nobody was writing love poems. But Sarah turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to that boy. She rolled in with a wagon full of real furniture and real beds. First thing, she scrubbed the cabin down to the bare wood. Then she made Thomas lay a proper floor and cut an actual window into the wall. And then she got a good look at Abe, filthy, wild, dressed in rags, and something in her just clicked. This one's different. There's a fire behind his eyes. She'd brought a few books of her own, 5, maybe 6. To Abe, that was the Library of Alexandria. She let him read instead of work. She stood between him and a father who thought reading was a waste of good daylight. "Thomas," she'd say, "this boy is going to be somebody. Leave him be." Abe worshipped her the rest of his life, called her mother, said flat out she was the one who made a man out of him. Think about that. An illiterate woman from the backwoods looked at a ragged, overlooked kid and saw the future everyone else walked right past. And then she handed in the shot at it. No Sarah Bush Johnston, no President Lincoln. Simple as that. And by his teens, the fire she'd protected had a body to match. A strange, towering one. By 16, Abe had shot up to 6'4". In an era when the average man topped out around 5'7", he looked like something built in a lab. Endless arms, huge hands, freakish strength. And here's the twist. He hated hard labor. Hated the farm, the animals, all of it. He loved exactly one thing: books. He read lying by the fire. He read while he plowed. He read at night by burning splinters of wood. The neighbors figured he was odd, lazy, a little touched in the head. In a world that ran on muscle, a boy who'd rather hold a book than an axe was suspicious. His own father didn't get it either. Back then, by law, a son owed his labor to his father until he turned 21. So Thomas hired Abe out to the neighbors and pocketed every cent the boy earned. Abe seethed and obeyed, and saved up the resentment for later. Then, at 19, love. Anne Rutledge, a tavern keeper's daughter, sharp and kind. They met in secret. He wrote her poems, and by every account, they were god-awful poems. They planned to marry once he got on his feet. Then she caught typhoid and died at 22. And Abe came apart. Fell so far, his friends were scared to leave him alone in a room. That was his first taste of the thing he'd later name the Black Dog, the depression that would stalk him for the rest of his days. Remember the black dog? It never really leaves. But at 21, the cage door finally swings open. 21, and Abe is a free man. The family moved again to Illinois. He helped them settle, squared his debt to his father, and walked. Drifted into a speck of a town called New Salem. Clerked in a store, slept on the counter, ate the leftovers. And here, finally, he started teaching himself for real. Borrowed books off anyone who'd lend them. Walked 20 miles for a single volume. Got his hands on Euclid's geometry and worked the proofs for fun. He joined a debating society, and at first he just sat there and listened. Then he opened his mouth. And it turned out the gangly store clerk was a born speaker. Plain words that hit hard, stitched together with stories and jokes. Word got around about the funny, long-legged fellow named Abe. The humor wasn't just charm, though. It was armor. When the black dog came scratching at the door, he'd tell jokes to keep the dark out. Around the same time, the Black Hawk War kicked off. Abe signed up. Not because he wanted to fight, he was practically a pacifist, but because everybody went. His company voted him captain. A kid who'd been sleeping on a store counter was suddenly in charge of 100 men. He said later it meant more to him than becoming president. He never saw a battle. But one moment mattered. A starving old native man wandered into camp, and the soldiers wanted to kill him where he stood. Abe stepped between them. "Anyone who touches him, go through me first. I'm on the side of being human." And they backed down. First time he put his own body between a helpless man and a mob. It would not be the last. He came home to a bankrupt store and a mountain of debt, and spent 15 years paying it off. And somewhere in the middle of all that, he decided to become a lawyer. No university, no money, no connections, just borrowed law books and firelight. He passed the bar in 1836. A man with less than a year of schooling made himself an attorney by reading. His only diplomas were grit and will and brains. And they were about to put him in a courtroom. He moved to Springfield, the state capital, and the clients took one look and sniffed. This gangly hick in a wrinkled suit and muddy boots? But in a courtroom, he was a monster. Airtight arguments, played a jury like a fiddle. One famous case, a witness swore up and down he'd seen a killing clear as day by moonlight. Lincoln pulled out an almanac and proved the moon had already set an hour before the crime. The witness was lying. The client walked. And Honest Abe spread across the whole state. He waded into politics, too, and won a seat in the Illinois legislature. Moderate, practical. Roads, canals, schools. He already hated slavery, down in his bones. But he knew saying so out loud was political suicide when half the country owned human beings. So he waited. And then, at 32, he married a woman who nearly destroyed him and drove him straight to the top. 1842, Mary Todd, daughter of a rich Kentucky banker, educated, ambitious, sharp enough to draw blood, and fragile in ways that would haunt them both. They met at a party where Mary reportedly told a friend she'd marry the man who'd be president, glanced over at the awkward Lincoln, and added, "Maybe him." Bold call about a guy who'd been sleeping on a store counter a few years earlier. Abe was hooked. Finally, a woman who argued back instead of nodding along. He proposed, then he panicked. Actually bolted, wrote her a note, "I can't," and spiraled into a year-long depression. She waited him out. In 1842, they married, quiet, no fuss. A friend asked where he was headed. He said, "To my own execution, I suppose." The marriage was hard. She threw tantrums and objects. He'd go dead silent and walk it off for hours. But she believed in him with the fury of a true believer, and she kept shoving him toward the big stage. She was a little crazy. She was also right. They had 4 sons, and Abe adored them. Let them get away with murder, which appalled every serious man who came through the office. "Childhood's short," he'd say. He never got one. He was going to hand his boys the one he was cheated out of. And then, in 1850, Edward died. Tuberculosis, not quite 4 years old. Abe wept openly, almost unheard of for a man of his time. Mary fell apart for months. Dead children would haunt that marriage, and while one family drowned in private grief, the whole country was sliding toward a catastrophe with a single name: slavery. America in the 1850s was 2 nations wearing one flag. The North, industrial, crowding into cities, running on paid labor. The South, agricultural, and built from the foundation up on slavery. 4 million black people legally, property, bought, sold, and killed inside the law. The children born into it. Generation stacked on generation. For decades, a string of compromises held the thing together. Every new free state balanced out by a slave state. Then, in 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas rammed through the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which said new territories could just vote slavery up or down for themselves. That was dynamite under the foundation. Kansas turned into a straight-up shooting war. They called it Bleeding Kansas. Lincoln was livid. He came storming back into politics, joined the brand-new Republican Party, and finally started saying the thing out loud. Slavery is a moral evil. It turns human beings into objects. It spits on the Declaration of Independence, which says all men are created equal. The South lost its mind. Lincoln fired straight back. The Constitution doesn't protect slavery, it only tolerates it, and tolerance has an expiration date. He wasn't calling for it all to end tomorrow. He knew that road led to war. His plan was to box slavery in and let it die slow, over 50 or 100 years. But America was flat out of time. And Lincoln was about to walk onto the biggest stage in the country. 1858. Lincoln ran for the Senate against Douglas, the very man behind Kansas-Nebraska. 7 debates, all across Illinois. Thousands traveled just to watch. These were gladiator fights with words. Douglas said the people should decide slavery for themselves. That's democracy. Lincoln said democracy does not mean the right to vote for evil. No man has the right to vote another man into chains. Douglas said black men aren't equal to white men. It's the law of nature. Lincoln said, if a black man earns his bread by the sweat of his own labor, he has the right to eat it without asking anyone's permission. And in that, he is my equal, and yours. Lincoln lost the election, but newspapers printed those debates all over the country, and overnight, the name Lincoln meant something. Mary said, I told you, you'll be president. Abe just laughed. Woman, you are certifiably crazy. And the country lurched closer to the cliff. 1859. John Brown, radical abolitionist, religious zealot, decided to spark a slave uprising with his own hands. He seized the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. It fell apart in 2 days. They caught Brown and hanged him. And before they did, he said the crimes of this guilty land would only ever be washed out with blood. The South went into a panic. Now every Northerner was a potential terrorist. Lincoln drew a clean line. Brown was brave, and his cause was just. But his method was murder, and murder he could not bless. The South wasn't listening anymore. The gap between the two halves had become a canyon. And in 1860 came the election that finally cracked the nation in half. 1860. The Republicans gathered in Chicago to pick their man. The favorite was Senator William Seward of New York. Rich, famous, seasoned. Lincoln was the dark horse, a country lawyer who'd just lost a Senate race. But his team ran like a machine, worked the delegates, cut deals. Back Lincoln, and there's a job for you in the administration. First ballot, Seward leads, but he's short. Second ballot, Lincoln surges. Third ballot, Lincoln wins. The news reached him by telegram in Springfield. He stood up, quiet, and said, "There's a little woman down the street who'll want to hear this." He walked home. Mary opened the door. "Mary, we're going to Washington. I'm going to be president." She burst into tears. "I always knew it." But it was a broken kind of win. Only the North put him there. In the South, his name wasn't even printed on the ballots. He took the White House with about 40% of the vote, the lowest share any winner ever had. And the news hit the South like a match on gasoline. December 20th, 1860, 3 months before he'd even taken the oath, South Carolina walked out of the United States. Then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. By February, they'd built a whole new country, the Confederate States of America, with a constitution that guaranteed slavery forever. The nation broke apart before Lincoln was even sworn in, and someone wanted him dead before he could lift a finger to fix it. February 1861. Riding the train toward Washington, Lincoln got a tip. An assassination plot was waiting for him in Baltimore. He waved it off. But the detective Allan Pinkerton pushed hard, and in the dead of night, in different clothes, Lincoln slipped through Baltimore and reached Washington early. The papers roasted him for it. Cartoons of a coward sneaking into the Capitol in disguise. He was humiliated. He was also alive. March 4th, 1861, Inauguration Day. Washington felt like a city under siege. Troops in the streets, riflemen on the rooftops. Lincoln stood in front of thousands of people, and a good chunk of them wanted him in a grave. And he said, "We are not enemies, but friends. The mystic chords of memory will swell again when touched by the better angels of our nature." Beautiful words. Almost nobody was listening. He was now president of a country that had already stopped existing, and within weeks, the shooting started. April 1861, Fort Sumter, a federal fort in Charleston Harbor, its Union garrison surrounded. Lincoln sent ships loaded with food. No weapons, just food. The Confederates called it an act of war, and on April 12th, at 4:30 in the morning, they opened fire. 34 hours later, the fort surrendered, and the Civil War had begun. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers for 90 days. He honestly believed he'd crush the whole rebellion in 3 months. He had no idea what he was looking at. Nobody did. The war would run 4 years. It would kill somewhere around 620,000 men, more than every other American war put together. 2% of the entire population gone. Scale that to today and you're talking 6 million bodies, brother against brother. His call to arms backfired. 4 more states walked out rather than send troops south: Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina. But 4 slave states stayed loyal, teetering on the knife's edge. Lincoln said it plain, "I have to keep Kentucky. Lose Kentucky, and I lose the war." So he played rough. Jailed Maryland legislators without trial, suspended habeas corpus. "Tyrant," the liberals screamed. And he answered, "Would you rather the nation die with every law obeyed, or survive by bending a few of them?" A pragmatist, right down to the bone. And the first real battle was about to show everyone just how wrong they'd been about a quick, clean war. July 1861, Bull Run, right outside Washington. The North was cocky. Smash the rebels, home by supper. Congressmen rode out with picnic baskets to watch the show. Then General Thomas Jackson's brigade held its ground like a wall of stone. Stonewall Jackson, a legend born on the spot, and the Union line collapsed into a screaming rout. Congressmen with picnic baskets ran fastest of all. Lincoln didn't sleep that night. He brought in General George McClellan to build him a real army. And McClellan was a brilliant organizer, with one fatal flaw. He was terrified of actually fighting. Lincoln ordered him toward Richmond. McClellan wanted more men, more supplies, more time, and swore the enemy had twice the troops they really did. Months crawled by. The army drilled and marched and posed for photographs, and did not fight. Lincoln fumed. "If General McClellan isn't going to use the army, I'd like to borrow it for a while." McClellan ignored him, and in private letters called the president a guerrilla and an idiot. Lincoln took it, for now. But while McClellan sat on his hands in the east, a very different kind of general was fighting out west. Ulysses Grant. Plain, quiet, rumored to drink, taking forts on the western rivers one after another. When the Confederates at Fort Donelson asked for terms, Grant fired back. Unconditional surrender, no terms. Lincoln had finally found a general who actually fought. The whispers about the drinking reached Washington fast, and the advisors said, "Fire him." Lincoln said, "Find out what brand of whiskey he drinks, and I'll send a barrel to every other general I've got." April 1862, Shiloh. The Confederates hit Grant's camp by surprise, and by nightfall he was pinned against the river, and it looked done. An officer asked him, "What now?" Grant, bloodied and worn to the bone, said, "Tomorrow we attack." Reinforcements came overnight. He counterattacked. He won. But God, the price. 23,000 dead and wounded in 2 days. The papers screamed butcher and howled for his head. Lincoln said, "I can't spare this man. he fights. And while the generals bled the country white, Lincoln was wrestling with the question underneath the whole war: what in God's name to do about slavery? He started out careful. I'm fighting to save the Union, not to end slavery. Politics. Those border slave states were loyal but touchy, and plenty of northern boys had zero interest in dying for black people. But the pressure kept building. Escaped slaves came pouring toward Union lines by the thousands. Send them back to their owners? That was obscene. And then Lincoln saw it clear. Slavery was the Confederacy's soft spot. 4 million enslaved people grew the food and built the fortifications. Free them, and you gut the enemy from the inside. There was a bigger game, too. Britain and France were quietly leaning toward the Confederacy. They wanted that Southern cotton. But no European power would openly back slaveholders once the war became a war against slavery. Summer 1862, Lincoln wrote it, a proclamation freeing the enslaved, and showed his cabinet. Secretary Seward said, "Wait, announce it now? With the war going badly? And it reads as pure desperation. Wait for a victory." So Lincoln slid it into a drawer, and the bloodiest single day in American history was about to hand him one. September 1862, Robert E. Lee, the Confederacy's legend, a tactical genius, invaded the North for the first time. September 17th, the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day this country has ever seen. 23,000 men fell in one day, more than the entire War of 1812. The creek itself ran red. Lee pulled back to Virginia, so technically a Union win, though McClellan let him go without a chase. Lincoln walked that battlefield days later, stepping between the bodies. A photographer named Matthew Brady captured it, and for the first time ever, the public saw real photographs of war, not heroic paintings, corpses, hundreds of them. But Lincoln had his victory, half of one. Good enough. 5 days later, he pulled the proclamation out of the drawer, and the war changed forever. September 22, 1862, the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The heart of it, as of January 1, 1863, every enslaved person in Confederate territory is free. Now, legally, it was slippery. It only freed people where Lincoln had no actual power, while leaving slavery standing in the loyal border states where he did. Critics laughed themselves silly, but as a symbol, it was an earthquake. The war was now officially about freedom, not just union. The Confederacy raged that he was calling for a massacre. Lincoln answered, ice cold. You took up arms against the government first. Now reap what you sowed. January 1st, 1863, 4 million people declared free. Most were still in chains in practice, out on the plantations. But the legal foundation under slavery had just been blown to pieces. Black communities called it Jubilee. Lincoln said, "If my name ever goes into history, it'll be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." He knew what it might cost him. Half the country hated him. Re-election was a coin flip. Maybe they'd kill him. He signed it anyway. But freedom on paper still had to be won in blood. And the war got worse before it got better. November 1862, Lincoln fired McClellan and brought in Burnside. Mistake. At Fredericksburg, Burnside sent wave after wave of men straight into Lee's dug-in position on a hill. 13,000 Union casualties. A slaughter. Burnside wept on the field. "I killed my boys." Lincoln read the report and said, "If there's a worse place than hell, I'm in it." So he brought in Hooker, who charged Lee at Chancellorsville and got carved to pieces, outnumbered 2-1. A Confederate masterpiece that would cost them Stonewall Jackson, shot by his own men in the dark. Lee wept. "I have lost my right arm, 3 years in, no end in sight." Democrats demanded a truce. Radicals demanded the South be burned to ash. Lincoln walked the wire between them. And then, in the first days of July, everything turned. July 1863, Lee bet the whole war on a second invasion, Pennsylvania this time. On July 1st, his army slammed into the Union at a little town called Gettysburg. 3 days of carnage, the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil, 51,000 killed and wounded. When the bullets ran dry, men killed each other with bayonets and rocks. On July 3rd, Lee's last roll of the dice, Pickett's charge, 12,000 Confederates walking across open ground into Union fire. Half of them died. The charge broke. Lee retreated. And on July 4th, Independence Day, Grant took Vicksburg on the Mississippi after a 2-month siege and cut the Confederacy clean in half. 2 decisive wins, 2 days. The tide had turned. But God, the cost. And on that blood-stained field 4 months later, Lincoln would say the words that outlived all of it. November 1863, the dedication of a cemetery at Gettysburg. The main speaker, Edward Everett, talked for 2 solid hours. Then Lincoln, asked for a few appropriate remarks, stood up, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and spoke for 2 minutes. 272 words. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He spoke of the dead, and of the living's duty to finish their work. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The applause was polite. A lot of people were let down by how short it was. Everett wrote to him afterward, "I wish I'd come as near the central idea in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." Lincoln had no clue. He'd just given one of the greatest speeches in human history. Today, kids memorize it. Nobody remembers a single word of Everett's 2 hours. And by now, the war had aged Lincoln a full decade, and it wasn't done with him yet. 1864, year 4. Lincoln had aged 10 years in 3. The lines in his face like scars, hair gone gray. 54 years old, looking 70. Every single day, lists of the dead. Every name, somebody's son. He barely slept, wandering the White House at night while the black dog rolled in on waves. "I'm the most miserable man living," he told a friend. And still, he worked 18-hour days, and he kept the White House open to the public, so mothers could come and beg him to pardon sons sentenced to be shot for desertion. He almost always did. "If I can pick up a pen and give a boy back to his mother," he said, "I'll do it." March 1864, Lincoln finally found his general. He put Ulysses Grant in command of every Union army in the field. Grant showed up plain, rumpled uniform, nothing about him that said "Great Commander." Lincoln said, "I need one thing from you: victory." Grant said, "Give me men, supplies, and the politicians out of my way, and I'll fight." Finally, a general who didn't come with excuses. And Grant's strategy was simple and merciless. Total war. Destroy the South's ability to fight at all. May 1864. Grant chewed straight into Virginia, the wilderness where wounded men burned alive in a forest fire. Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, 7,000 men killed in 20 minutes, the one attack Grant said he regretted to his dying day. In a single month, he lost 55,000 men, more than Lee's entire army, and the papers branded him a butcher. Lincoln said, "I cannot spare this man. He fights." Grant dug in for a 9-month siege at Petersburg. Trench warfare, a preview of the First World War 30 years early. Meanwhile, William Sherman drove on Atlanta and took it on September 2, 1864, the industrial heart of the South. Then he pitched something insane. March the army clean across Georgia to the sea. No supply lines, live off the land. On November 15th, he burned Atlanta's military targets and started east, 62,000 men cutting a path 60 miles wide, tearing up railroads, heating the rails, and twisting them around trees. They called them Sherman's neckties, burning plantations, freeing the enslaved, who followed the army by the thousands. "War is hell," Sherman said. "The South should feel it." On December 21st, he took Savannah and wired Lincoln, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah." The South was broken, and still, somehow, fighting. But first, Lincoln had to survive an election, autumn 1864. And yes, America held an election in the middle of a civil war. The democracy did not stop, even as the country burned. Lincoln ran against George McClellan, the very general he'd fired, whose whole platform was "negotiate now," which meant surrender, recognize the Confederacy. And through the summer, Lincoln was losing. He wrote himself a private note, bracing to lose the whole thing. Then Atlanta fell. Sherman reached the sea. Grant kept the vice cranked tight, and the mood flipped. November 8, 1864, Lincoln won, 55%. He even took the soldiers at the front, 78% of them voting for the man asking them to keep dying. They voted to finish it. That night, Lincoln said, "The people have shown that a government of the people can survive a national crisis, a lesson to the whole world." And with the election behind him, he stood up and said the strangest thing any wartime leader ever said: "Forgive them." March 1865. The second inauguration in the rain, a short speech. Each side, he said, reads the same Bible and prays to the same God. The prayers of both could not be answered. He named slavery the sin of the whole nation, both sides guilty. Then the ending. "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive on to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan." In the middle of a war that had killed 600,000 people, he was asking for mercy. The Southern radicals heard it and understood. Lincoln won't hang us. The Northern radicals heard it and were furious. Mercy? They should burn. He chose a third road: justice without vengeance. April 1865. Grant closed the ring. Lee broke out of Petersburg with 50,000 starving, ragged men, the Union chasing him with 120,000 fresh troops. April 9th. Appomattox. Lee was surrounded, nowhere left to run. He and Grant met in the home of a man named Wilmer McLean. And here's the irony. The war had started on McLean's farm at Bull Run in 1861, and he'd moved his whole family away to escape it. The war found him anyway. Lee arrived in a spotless dress uniform, sword at his side, aristocrat to the last. Grant showed up in a muddy coat with no insignia, looking like any private in the line. And Grant was generous. Officers keep their sidearms. Soldiers take their horses home for the spring plowing. No prosecutions. Lee signed. The Union soldiers started to cheer and Grant shut them down. The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again. Lincoln had saved the Union and killed slavery. He had 5 days left to live. April 14th, 1865. Good Friday. Lincoln was happy, relaxed, for the first time in 4 years. That evening, he and Mary went to Ford's Theater for a comedy. Mary asked if he wanted to invite anyone along. "No," he said. "I just want to be with you." They sat in the presidential box. Lincoln laughed at the jokes. Behind him, the door opened. In stepped John Wilkes Booth, 26 years old, an actor, a fanatical believer in the Confederacy. He walked up behind the president, pressed a single-shot Derringer to the back of his head, and fired point blank. The bullet tore through his brain. Lincoln slumped forward without a sound. Booth vaulted down onto the stage, 12 feet, broke his leg on the landing, got up anyway, and screamed, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus, always to tyrants. Then he vanished into the night on horseback. They carried Lincoln to a house across the street and laid him diagonal across a bed, because he was too tall to fit any other way. The wound was fatal. The bullet was in his brain. Nothing to be done. The family gathered. He lingered all night, breathing hard and ragged. April 15th, 22 minutes past 7 in the morning, the breathing stopped. Secretary Stanton, a man who'd fought with Lincoln for 4 straight years, wept and said, "Now he belongs to the ages." 56 years old, murdered 5 days after winning the war. He saved the Union. He destroyed slavery. He said words that will never die, and he never got to see the peace he made. The country went into mourning. Lincoln's body traveled by train from Washington back to Illinois. 1,600 miles, 7 states, 12 days. At every station, thousands stood in silence and wept. In New York, 500,000 people filed past the coffin. Black communities wept in the open. Their Moses was dead. On May 4th, they buried him in Springfield, next to his sons. Booth ran south. Federal agents cornered him in a Virginia barn 12 days later and set it on fire. A sergeant shot him through a gap in the boards, and the bullet struck the same vertebrae Booth's own bullet had shattered in Lincoln. He died paralyzed, hours later. 4 of his conspirators were hanged, and then the man Lincoln had picked as his vice president took over and undid nearly all of it. Andrew Johnson, a former slaveholder who'd stayed loyal to the Union. He hated the plantation aristocrats, but he despised black people even more. He pardoned ex-Confederates by the thousands, handed them back their land, and let the southern states pass black codes, laws that rebuilt slavery under a brand new name, slavery, walking back in through the side door. Congress exploded. The radical Republicans seized control and passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, abolishing slavery forever, granting citizenship, guaranteeing the vote. On paper. In practice, the South fought back with terror. The Klan, lynchings, burned schools. In 1877, the federal troops pulled out, and the age of Jim Crow began. Separate but equal, a lie that stood for 80 years. Real equality wouldn't come for another century with the Civil Rights Movement, and Martin Luther King would give his "I Have a Dream" speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963. Fitting. Lincoln's work finished by his heirs. After he died, the canonizing began. Father Abraham, the great emancipator, almost a saint. His face on the $5 bill and the penny, carved into Mount Rushmore. His memorial, a literal temple, Lincoln seated like Zeus. But the real man was messier than the marble. Yes, he freed the enslaved, but mostly once it became a military necessity. Yes, he believed all men were created equal, but he doubted whether black and white could live together, and for years backed the idea of shipping freed people overseas. Yes, he was a great orator and a cunning politician who traded government jobs for votes. Yes, he saved democracy and suspended habeas corpus, jailed critics, shut down newspapers. Contradictions, all of them, and every one of them makes him a human being instead of a statue. He knew it. "I do the best I know how," he said, "the very best I can, and I mean to keep it up to the end." Not a fearless hero, just a regular man trying to manage an impossible situation. Mary paid the worst price of anyone. She'd already buried 2 sons. Now she'd watched her husband shot to death, his blood on her dress. She held seances, trying to reach the dead, sank into debt, and in 1875, her own son had her committed to an asylum. She died in 1882, in the same house where Lincoln had once said, "Mary, we're going to Washington." They buried her beside her husband and her boys. The family, at last, back together. So what did he leave behind? First, the country itself. Without him, it splits. The Confederacy goes independent, a slave-holding nation spreading south. He held the Union together with pure will and an ocean of blood. Second, freedom. 4 million people out of bondage. It didn't cure racism, but it tore out the legal roots of slavery. And third, an idea that a democracy can survive an existential crisis, that a government of the people would not perish from the earth. He proved it in blood. And every time this country hits a wall, it comes back to Lincoln. He could have let the South go. He didn't. The Union was not up for debate. He could have left slavery alone for a fast, easy peace. He didn't. Slavery had to die. He could have quit when the war went to hell, when the generals failed, when the losses were monstrous. He didn't. We must finish the work. And here's the last irony. Lincoln hated war. He was practically a pacifist. And he went down in history as the commander-in-chief of the bloodiest war America ever fought. "I claim not to have controlled events," he said. "Events have controlled me." The humility of a genius. He never planned to be the great emancipator. He just answered the crisis better than anyone else alive could have. And that's the whole lesson. You don't have to be born a genius. You don't need money or schooling or connections. You need will and principle and the nerve to stand up when every voice in the room says, "Sit down." Lincoln said it best. "I walk slowly, but I never walk backward." He was born on February 12, 1809, in a cabin with no windows. He died on April 15, 1865, in a small bedroom across the street from a theater. 56 years of life, 4 years as president, 1 bullet to the head. But his ideas live, his words live, his example lives. His face is on the penny, the smallest coin there is. The greatest of men on the humblest of coins. He'd have loved that joke. His story isn't a fairy tale, it's a reminder. Greatness isn't born in palaces, it's born in the fight, in choosing the right thing when giving up would be so much easier. He chose right, again and again, all the way to his last breath. And the world was never the same. That's what it means to be a human being, an ordinary one, who became a legend. Not because he was perfect, but because he didn't flinch when everything was on fire.